Hi everybody, I just wanted to touch base about last night's case study presentations again since we didn't have a lot of time to wrap up at the end of class. First of all, I want to give a big thank you to the groups who went on last night because it's never easy to be first. I think that both groups did a good job of kind of showing what the case studies are all about, and again, I know it's very difficult to go first, so I want to offer a thank you to those groups who did. I did give some feedback and ask some questions on the first group's case study last night, so what I'm going to do is focus on the second case study, which dealt with the group's reading that you had for this week, or for this week. So that group did an excellent job of picking a concise problem and then analyzing that problem specifically using the terminology from the text and then offering solutions that linked to the problem statement, and that kind of flowed and made sense from the analysis that they had. One of the key themes that they kept coming back to was Bob's lack of leadership. So if you remember from the case study last night, Bob was the designated team leader of the quote-unquote hot team, but he didn't really do much. He kind of appointed a quote-unquote shepherd, which is really just fancy terminology for someone else to do most of the work for him. And then Lydia became the shepherd. She was a team member. She volunteered to be the shepherd and basically kind of took over all of the coordinating roles from there. And we don't really hear much more in the case study about what Bob did or had to offer, other than kind of maybe checking in with Lydia once in a while, and that's it. So the issue of Bob's leadership was a big issue in the case study. However, if you think to the text, you could probably see, if you remember what we talked about with teams, he probably thought, although I'm sure he knew he wasn't doing much, but he could have made the argument that because it was a work team, he thought he was doing the coordinating rather than managing. Because if you remember, the farther into the team spectrum we get, the less we have direct control and the more that we have a kind of coordinating role. So he might have thought by taking this hands-off approach that he was embodying this kind of new leadership that we're supposed to see in teams. But then, of course, having Lydia step in and do all the work and not providing her with any direction as to how to do that or any support as to how to do that really kind of left her hanging. So I would definitely agree that his leadership was in a deficit, but at the same time, we touched on it briefly, but we didn't talk a ton about how, in terms of the benefits and drawbacks of groups, one of the big drawbacks of groups is that using groups and teams in the workplace sometimes will take a restructuring of the workplace because the workplace is just not set up to facilitate groups and teams, and it takes a lot of training, a lot of time, and a lot of money. And it sounds like this organization, I think the name was New Innovations or New Ideas, it sounds like they heard about this idea of a hot team, they decided to try it out, and they didn't really invest in the training that Bob or anybody else would need in order to effectively work in a group or a team. They didn't find a way to clear the schedules of the people who had to be part of the team. So in addition to Bob's poor leadership, another problem in this case study was just the fact that, although we're not given a lot of information about it, you can kind of infer that the organization didn't really invest the proper resources to establish the team. So let's see, what else? The hot team. So the group touched on it, but one thing that the case study mentions is that the organization wanted to try out this new type of team called a hot team. So the hot team is an example of the parallel structure that we talked about in class the other night, where people who have reporting responsibilities to different areas of the organization kind of like leave their responsibilities for a short period of time. At this time it was 3 times over 90 days and then meeting online in order to participate in this task force. And so it's an example of diagonal communication again, sort of like a matrix structure, because all of the members of the hot team had their usual work responsibilities, but then they also had to report into this team and theoretically report into Bob, although again we can see that nobody really respected his authority in this group or team at all. Some of the other problems why Bob's leadership might not have worked in this situation but might have been a better approach in other situations is that if you think about the terms of group development, so if you think back to the phasic model, there's the norming and storming stages where people get to know each other and then they go through productive conflict. I mentioned, as did the group, that because of the truncated time, even though the group members spent time introducing themselves to each other, they never really got into that kind of like productive conflict stage. So without that opportunity for interpersonal talk and for teams to kind of like bond together and commit to each other, they didn't really have much of an opportunity to lay the groundwork. Or if you think about the different processes, the relational track, the relational processes didn't really have a chance to get underway. Really, neither did the task processes. The only thing that this particular team dealt with was the topical processes. So what is this project about and how do we solve the problem? But they never figured out how are we going to work together and how are we going to divide up the tasks or manage the tasks for this project. And again, without attending to all three tracks, the project kind of stalled. Although I think that the group did a great job of identifying punctuated equilibrium as kind of the way this team worked. The team was very slow, and then all of a sudden, like I would say it was even past the halfway point, maybe 2/3 of the way, they really picked up the pace and started to get stuff done. Mostly probably because Lydia really was pushing it, but I think that organizational members or people in general do have this kind of intuitive sense, okay, we've procrastinated as long as we can, now we have to get started. So again, I said the punctuated equilibrium model last night in class, not the most ideal model. It's the way a lot of us work, but it's not the best, and I think we could see how it didn't totally play out the best way in this particular organization or case study. Let's see. The group also made a good point about Bob's expectations. He was lenient, he didn't really establish goals or criteria up front, and therefore the group really didn't, in addition to not being committed to each other interpersonally, they didn't really have a good idea of what they were working for or why they were part of this team. Like, it was never established as something that was so important that they had to be committed to it, and they didn't really have any goals to follow through other than to come up with some innovative idea. And so again, without goals to work towards, there was no group cohesiveness, and they didn't really work towards anything together. Let's see. The solutions were really great. The solutions that they offered were good. However, making Lydia the team leader, it was actually too late because the team was meeting for the final time to present their final solutions and final ideas. So after that, the group was supposed to disband. This was just a temporary group or team, came together, solved the problems, and then disbanded. However, I agree that Lydia should have then become the group leader because she was investing all the time and all the work, and just also in terms of establishing more frequent communication, more face-to-face communication, better expectations. I think those were all solutions that the group came up with. Those were all great ideas because they really spoke to the problems that the group had been having all along. So I think that's about it. There was something else I wanted to say, but I forgot it. But of course, as you probably know, I could go on for a long time about this. So I just think that both the case studies from last night hopefully drew really strong parallels for you between what we talked about in class and what you read for class and how it might look in an organizational setting. And then hopefully for those of you who did not go last night, as you move forward towards your completing your case studies, you'll be able to make these connections for yourself, especially now that you've seen some examples of how it's done. In terms of general, and this has nothing to do with what was or wasn't presented last night, just again some general guidelines to touch back on with the case study. You'll find the case study readings and the case study assignment sheet in the case study folder on Angel, so be sure to really read through and familiarize yourself with the expectations and requirements for the paper so that you can touch on everything that needs to be touched on in the paper and the presentation. Let's see, the case study reading is also in the case study folder, and so they're labeled according to your topic. So make sure that you analyze, use the readings from that week. So for example, if you're the diversity case study, then you'll use the diversity reading that the whole class does that week in order to analyze the diversity case study. And both groups did that last night. So you know, I heard terminology from the readings in both of the case studies. So I think that's a pretty clear concept, but I still want to make sure that it's clear to you. Also, the problem statement should be a concise 1 to 2 word, not 1 to 2 words, 1 to 2 sentences, and then your analysis is where you really dig into what the book says and what all the problems were and what was going on. But the problem statement, if somebody asked you to say what's going on in this case study in 30 seconds or less, that's what the problem statement really should be. So it should be very concise. And then your problem statement feeds into your analysis, which feeds into your solutions. So again, I hope you really enjoyed the case studies last night. I know that I did. And if you have any questions moving forward about the case studies or anything else, please feel free to reach out to me. Have a great week.